Federalism. It's a big word thrown around, and it's a big part of the history of our government and the creation of our nation. But it's important to understand how federalism came to be, why it became such a prominent political standpoint, and the challenges this ideology faced as it rose in prominence. We also need to understand how the Constitution's roots in federalism affect our modern lives, and how federalism has evolved over the course of our nation's history. It's a long journey, so let's get started.
So, what caused the birth of federalism? Why was it needed, you may ask? Well, after the Revolutionary War, there was an encroaching need for new government. The United States were no longer burdened by the monarchical rule of Britain. And now that the US was its own entity, there was a lot of room for individuality and the creation of a new system. To interimly remedy this and to attempt to satisfy everybody's worries about a potential repeat of tyrannical rule, the Articles of Confederation were created. These articles essentially outlined a very loose central government amongst the 13 states, where each state was essentially their own independent entity, but was still intertwined in terms of allyship and protection. It sort of created a league of friendship between all of the states, many believing that that would be sufficient in terms of showing their unified strength. This meant that each individual state essentially had their own sovereignty. But after some time passed under this system, it became clear that this form of government was not sustainable and not indicative enough of strength or substantial independence, things that the United States really needed to focus on if they wanted to show themselves as a prominent power on the world stage. So what next? Well, this is when federalism really begins to emerge and come into play. One of the primary weaknesses of the Articles was that the central government was not strong enough at all. Federalism came out of this, preaching primary tenets of a really strong central government, overseeing governance of international relations, and just general overarching issues for the country, but still maintaining local governments to deal with more local issues. But in usual political fashion, not everybody was aligned with these ideas, and there was still an overarching fear of creating too strong of a central government. For some reference, and to maybe refresh some of your former knowledge on this topic, the anti-federalist, sometimes known as democratic Republican ideals, are often associated with Thomas Jefferson, and the federalist ideals are often associated with Alexander Hamilton. Now, federalism really wanted the national government to be the primary power in the nation. It was pretty prominent in urban populations as well as northern states. Federalists also wanted to make sure that taxes, currency, and debt were all managed at a national level, as well as jurisdiction over the military and protection of the country from both internal and external threats to the country as a whole. A really big part of federalism ended up being the creation of a national bank, which was created to get the country out of all of the war debt that they had accumulated from the Revolutionary War, which ultimately ended up being successful. On the other hand, anti-federalists really wanted to maintain primarily state control of most things having to do with governance. This thought process was much more prominent in southern states with more rural populations, as these populations didn't want to feel underrepresented in a democracy or a system where power was in numbers. They didn't want to pay a lot of taxes or deal with the war debt through a national bank, as many of them had personal interests that they believed might not be met with this system of paying off debt. They were also hesitant, again, because the fear of too much centralized power and not enough personal liberties. A primary document that really breaks down the reasoning behind the ideals of federalism is Fed 10 by James Madison. Fed 10 acknowledges that too much factionalism and factionalism that is directly created through the government, which the division into small state governments did create, was counterproductive to the success of a republic. It states, when a majority is included in a faction, the form of a popular government, on the other hand, enables it to sacrifice to its ruling passion or interest both the public good and the rights of the citizens. Now, what is this really saying? And what does it mean in more simplified terms? Well, it's really highlighting that the development of factions is sort of inevitable in a big group of people within the nation. through an overarching democratic system, there's an opportunity for the voices of the majority to be heard, and everybody will get some sort of voice in what actually happens on a federal level. And so eventually, the new United States Constitution was created with a much larger focus on federal government than the Articles of Confederation ever had. Now, Elise is going to talk more about that.
Thank you to Ava for explaining the historical origins of federalism. The definition of federalism we use today differs a bit from what it has historically been known as. In the modern United States, federalism is defined as a system in which the national and state governments share power and derive power from the people. Now let's go to the thought bubble to take a deeper dive into federalism within the Constitution. The Constitution clearly outlines certain governing powers that only the federal government can exert, including the power to declare war, coin money, and regulate commerce between states. These powers are known as exclusive powers. The 10th Amendment states that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. This key statement sets up the reserved powers, or powers that only the states can exert. Such powers include the power to establish local governments, regulate commerce within the state, conduct elections, and legislate public health and safety measures. Powers that both the state and federal government share are known as concurrent powers. These include the power to tax, establish courts, build infrastructure, and borrow money. So you can blame federalism for having to pay 2 sets of taxes. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Now, while both the federal and state governments have extensive responsibilities and capabilities, the Bill of Rights ensures our government does not overreach into the rights of citizens. As many of you are familiar with, these first 10 amendments to the Constitution protect many of our natural liberties, including freedom of speech, press, and assembly, as well as the right to bear arms, protection against unwarranted search and seizure, and the guarantee of a speedy and public trial, judged by a jury of peers if accused of a crime. These amendments initially only applied to the federal government. While many state constitutions protected the freedoms of their people, there was no law directly preserving the Bill of Rights within each state. However, the 14th Amendment changed this, when it states that no state shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. Okay, so maybe that's a bit of constitutional mumbo-jumbo. The key thing to remember here is that this sets up the incorporation doctrine, which many argue requires states to preserve the freedoms protected by the Bill of Rights within their own constitutions. Outside of delegating and denying state and federal powers, the Constitution also creates a framework for federalism in dealing with relations between states and potential disputes between state and national governments. Let's go to the thought bubble. Article 3, which sets up the judicial branch, clarifies that arguments between states are to be settled by the Supreme Court. Article 4 sets up a whole slew of important clauses. The full faith and credit clause requires states to recognize the judicial proceedings and contracts of other states. For example, if a couple is married in California and decides to move to Colorado, the full faith and credit clause ensures that their marital status continues to be recognized in their new home. The Privileges and Immunities Clause ensures citizens of one state have the same rights as citizens in the other states. To illustrate, under the Privileges and Immunities Clause, both residents and non-residents must pay the same sales tax. California can't tax a Colorado resident more for apples simply because they don't live anywhere near the beach, though this is most definitely a shame. Interestingly, the Supreme Court has ruled that this clause does not apply to public university tuition. So those of you who are hoping to get a tuition discount at the University of Michigan, I regret to inform you that you'll still be paying nearly $30,000 a year, as compared to the $8,000 a year tuition for Michigan residents. Lastly, the extradition clause ensures that criminals cannot find refuge across state lines. States must return criminals to the state they have been convicted in under this clause. Whew, that's a lot of clauses to remember. Before we move on, there's one very important clause that you definitely need to remember, one that many consider to be supreme overall. Have you guessed it? Yes, the Supremacy Clause. Article 6 of the Constitution states that this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made, under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. This boils down to saying that any national law or mandate overrides state laws. For example, if California creates a law that forces all dog owners to pick up their dog's poop, but then the federal government passes a law saying that dog owners do not have to pick up their dog's poop, the national law overrides California law, and poop does not have to be picked up. That stinks. Anyways, thanks, Thought Bubble. Just like our country, federalism is constantly changing. Up until the Civil War, power was separately and equally divided between the state and federal governments in a system known as dual federalism. Under this system, also known as layer cake federalism, the federal government held a much more limited role as compared to what we see today. It was expected to only carry out powers explicitly delegated to it by the Constitution, giving all other powers to state governments. Throughout the Civil War, the question of states' rights consistently haunted the Union. Did individual states have the right to nullify federal laws they did not agree with? And even further, could individual states completely secede from the Union? When the Union won the Civil War, the federal government worked to limit the power of states and strengthen its own power, while still reigning in an era of dual federalism. This system was completely overhauled with the advent of the Great Depression. Oh, look, it's time for our open letter. An open letter to President Herbert Hoover. Dear Herbert, unfortunately, history has deemed you as one of the major causes of the Great Depression. You believed in the power of the market and American individualism to a fault. I mean, you did basically leave the average American behind as a guy who said, economic depression cannot be cured by legislative action or executive pronouncement. Economic wounds must be healed by the action of cells of the economic body, that is, the producers and consumers themselves. But I forgive you. You were a victim of dual federalism, after all. You believed in a limited government, as everybody before you had. Directly interfering with the economy and creating jobs through the federal government would have violated countless principles of the rights of states. Unfortunately, sticking with the status quo did not bode well for you, but this open letter is meant to forgive you. Just blame it on dual federalism. Sincerely, Elise Huang. So after Hoover felt up handling the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal greatly expanded federal power, setting up countless organizations intended to lift the United States out of its depression. These federal programs often worked with state and local governments, creating the foundation for federalism we see today. Cooperative federalism. Also known as marble cake federalism, cooperative federalism describes a balance between the state and federal governments in which the two work together on varying levels and issues for the betterment of our republic. Today, we can see cooperative federalism through various federal grants given to states. These grants both allow states to exert their powers freely while receiving support from the national government, while also allowing the national government to force states to meet certain objectives or set up certain projects using funding as a point of coercion. There are two main types of federal grants: categorical grants and block grants. The majority of funding goes towards categorical grants. These grants are highly prescriptive and restrictive, giving states exact criteria to meet or projects to execute in order to receive funding. In contrast, block grants are much looser in their guidelines. The federal government will give states money in the form of block grants that are meant to go towards a general goal, such as welfare or conservation. The state then gets to use this money however they want, as long as the initiatives funded are related to the goals of the block grant. One way I like to see it is that categorical grants treat states like toddlers or little kids, while block grants treat states like teenagers. Thank you for tuning in to this week's crash course. Today, we learned a bit more about federalism, from its origins in some of the first political parties that developed after the Revolutionary War, to federalism within the Constitution, to federalism as it relates to the federal funding given to states today. We'll see you next week.